safety, which then itself falls in 1795. That's the Thermidor date, which the regime established then, also with a constitution, falls in 1799. Bonaparte falls in 1810s, 1814, 15. As a restoration, think of the term restoration, which is already an implication of cycle, right? It was invented at the time of the English revolutions, but the French Revolution involves a restoration too, after Napoleon. So restorations, and then, of course, new revolution, 1848, and so on, all the way down to the revolutionary process that overthrows Napoleon himself. So the cycle is there, right? It is there for anybody to observe. But a theorist like Marx wants to explain it and not just describe it, right? I think that's the most important point. And attempt at theorization comes naturally to him because he's already a theorist of business cycles. His theory of capitalist development is cyclical, from crisis to reconstruction to new crisis to new reconstruction, and at some point it's supposed to be a step to a revolutionary transformation. That's the way his theory works. Now, how that relates to the idea of political cycles is something I cannot solve today. I've been just thinking about it last couple of days, but it is not possible to say that the moments of the political cycle come directly in response to phases of the economic one. That would be a very deterministic reading of Marx and would be certainly incorrect for the phenomena that he was interested in France and Germany. So he discovers political cycles, which is not seen by him even analogically with respect to the business cycle. This, as I think you will all know, this anticipation of Marx becomes politically most relevant during the revolutions of the 20th century, especially the Russian Revolution. Lenin faces the obvious problem that what Marx assumes for a developed capitalist society is not Russian reality, but nevertheless, an insurrection and revolutionary change do occur in Russia, and itself then enters into a cyclical process which resembles some of the phases of the French Revolution. You'll see something about this in just a second, but which is also unique in many of its features. For example, the famous dual power established in February 1917, the first revolution, which then is ended in October, then dual power ends. With dual power ending, there's a constitutional turn, election of Constituent Assembly, which itself comes down, and so on. And of course, in Russia, you could already one could repeat the question I already asked before about economic models, because there is also an economic cycle of Russian development. The names probably should be well known to you. War, communism, new economic policy. I left out the term, maybe I can write it right in front of you, revolution from above, which is often the description of the Stalinist turn to full authoritarianism. So both Marx and the Marxist revolutions of the 20th century encountered a cycle. Paradoxically, in the case of the 20th century revolutionaries, it's a cycle within their own revolution, but that is how history works. Just because you know it doesn't mean you escape it. Now, of course, our interest today should not be these descriptions, because we could talk about Russian and French history forever if we attempted to describe all these events and phases. So what interests us is the theoretical explanation. And Marx, leaving now aside the explanation of the business cycle, which is not our topic today at all, does attempt also to explain the cycle of, well, let's call it liberalism, but it could be called parliamentarism and authoritarianism in the bourgeois revolution. His earliest explanation, his earliest attempt to deal with it, has to do with the state civil society problem, the emergence of a domain of civil society freed from state interventionism in the French Revolution, but then the suppression of that independent civil society in the Jacobin Terror, its reemergence during the Restoration. All this has to do with the state civil society problem, and which of these two domains will dominate. Note that I say civil bourgeois because the German term bürgerliche Gesellschaft implies both. And for Marx, one must literally use the term civil and bourgeois interchangeably. Four questions come up for Marx in trying to explain this cycle further than just the abstract tension between state and civil society. Why parliamentarism in the first place, or why liberal parliamentarism or liberal constitutionalism in the first place? Why does that emerge, replacing the absolute monarchies? If it emerged, the second question is, why the turn to dictatorship? The third question, and this is not one that Marx asked, but I ask in retrospect, did he actually discover populism as he was dealing with the cycle? In other words, does populism, I put into quotation marks because the term is never used by Marx, does it play a role in the cycle? And if it does it do so in the ascending phase toward democracy or constitutionalism rather, or in a descending phase toward the dictatorship, or perhaps plays a role in both? And then the question, which for Marx was the most important one, and this term comes up once again in our current literature of breakdowns and transitions, is how to break the cycle. Is it possible to break it? I mean, you can think about it. You can imagine that even to Marx, dictatorship was a very serious negative development, which should be resisted and then reversed. But how to avoid continually falling into it, that becomes the problem. You can see that dictatorship is especially a problem for Marx, because he recognizes that there is a lot so the role of breaking it would be the most important one, political role. And I think it was something you can all imagine. You all know this. It's an obvious answer. Only proletarian revolution could break it. But proletarian revolution itself could play a role in the making of the cycle. And Marx is aware of it, which is why he compares the mere insurrection to the revolution. In other words, insurrections, for example, in the case of French history, lead to the confirmation of the cycle. And insurrection, in a way, is just as much an instrument in negative developments as coups and putsches are. In this respect, Marx's critique of Jacobinism, which is repeatedly affirmed in his works, and in particular its revival by Marx's own contemporary Auguste Blanqui, are anticipations of left populism here treated critically. So let me try to answer the questions I myself have raised, because that is the only way that Marx's theory of the cycle becomes clear. The first question: why parliamentarism in the first place? Why parliamentarism in the first place? After the overthrow of the absolute monarchies, the old regimes, why turn to parliamentarism? Well, the thing is that the bourgeoisie rooted in civil bourgeois society is not first of all not a single strata or stratum, not a single stratum. It has divisions and tensions within it, and it is linked politically in the revolutions to also challenges from below. Popular mobilization, the sans-culottes in France is perhaps the most historical example, the urban popular movement. So the bourgeoisie faces two problems: division within itself as a class and potential threats from below. And parliamentarism is a way of answering both of these problems, right? It creates a method through which the different segments of the bourgeoisie can coordinate their own relations and produce a single set of policies supposedly beneficial to all of them. That's one dimension. And the other dimension is that parliamentarism can be presented as a rule through representatives of the electorate itself. In other words, it is a way, and Marx always believed this, to disguise the fact that there is a new ruling stratum or a new ruling class composed of several strata, and presented as a form of popular rule. So these are the two dimensions. Immediately the question arises, even as I'm writing my lectures, I always think of what is wrong with it. And this very neat formula I just gave it could be easily criticized by the fact that assemblies in government, not necessarily parliamentarism in the modern sense, are very old. In Western history, I say this to this group because in some of your histories, you will not find the same type of institutions, or at least not exactly in the same form. But in any case, in the history of the West, Rome has two assemblies, the Senate and the Popular Assembly, which is involves a certain element of direct participation. The Ständerstaat of the late medieval period is itself assembly government. Hegel brings this form to Marx's attention very, very early. But I mean, every European historian, historically oriented European thinker knew that. So so you cannot just derive the history of parliamentarism from the double tension, which I explained before, coordination and preemption. It also emerges from historical roots. This is so clear in France, where it is the États généraux, the Estates General, that initially converted into a modern parliament, or at least a parliament that anticipates a modern form. Now, why this new modern form? I think Marx explained this in several places, but I think there are two important dimensions of this explanation too. With the emergence of individual rights, which are linked to the emerging form of property, the older forms of status-based assemblies are no longer relevant. Such legally defined statuses no longer exist, and they have to be replaced. It's interesting how we have a remnant of that status distinction in many countries where there's a Senate, which, by the way, of course, is a Roman name for the institution, but it is an upper chamber. And of course, House of Lords is even more medieval in its nomenclature. In any case, in spite of those remnants and survivals, modern parliamentarism is based on individual rights, and Marx has described it. I already try to answer the second question the second question before or at least implicitly, the dimensions. I mentioned the dimensions in which the second question would be answered. Remember that the reason for parliamentarism is coordination and preemption of working class challenges. The coordination can break down, and working class challenges can become, with the formation of large parties and unions, becomes especially problematic. And so in order to solve coordination problems, tensions within the dominant class, and to this time not just disguise the form of rule, but to genuinely control and preempt challenges from the new class, dictatorship becomes a possibility. The first phase of the cycle is derived from first this dimension. Marx really has no historical opportunity to really learn how the second phase of the cycle emerges. Although in the French Revolution, this becomes this process could be documented through the breakdown of the dictatorship of the Committee of Public Safety, and in this sense, the Thermidorians could be represented as the initiators of the second phase of the cycle. Marx's only explanation is, and it is not absurd, that during even the dictatorship, the socioeconomic foundations of bourgeois rule are developed. So even as in that dictatorship phase, direct rule is taken away from the economically dominant class, economically and materially, this class becomes more and more powerful and wants again to retrieve its own form of rule. So question 2 is partially answered by explaining why the turn to dictatorship, and then to why dictatorships themselves are challenged. My question 3 was, does populism play a role in the cycle? Marx really stresses throughout his 18 Brumaire, which is the most important text for us today, that popular support plays a role in both phases of the cycle. Absolute regimes are brought down to a combination of middle-class movements with their intellectuals and mobilization of popular strata. Again, in Paris, the sans-culottes become the symbol of this. But the authoritarian turn, Marx is extremely careful in suggesting that it too has a popular base. Now, Marx, of course, runs into a kind of puzzle here, because on the one side, he wants to talk about the people who are, in some sense, the basis of the two different phases of the cycle, even claiming that it is not impossible for a class to embody the people. Pars pro toto is the term I use, a part embodying the whole. So on the one side, he thinks that such effort, even on part of bourgeoisie, has some legitimacy, because there's a moment in which revolutionary classes do represent the whole people. On the other side, he also suggests that the whole people is a fantasy. It's never a united actor, and it can never be, its interests in that sense can never be embodied in a single actor or a single group. This is what I mean by discovering the populism problem, and it is there in both cases. The whole bourgeoisie, he says, claims to rule in the name of the people, in the name of the whole people, which again he considers a fantasy and an ideology and a misrepresentation. But the dictator also rules in the name of the people. Well, interesting thing is that, for example, that Napoleon III or Bonaparte restores universal suffrage that was suspended and briefly abrogated by the oligarchy emerging from the 1848 revolution. Once we focus on this issue of universal suffrage, we can see that logically there are two forms of representation in the cycle, which can be reduced to, on the one side, the parliamentary one, and the other, the plebiscite. Lots of people would consider one or the other to be the more valid embodiment of the will of the people. Marx is skeptical with respect to both of them, but one institution which underlies, in some sense, both, namely universal suffrage, he suggests has a historically positive moment. In other words, universal suffrage, though it's not the end stage of a political transformation that he would like to support, is nonetheless an important step forward. This, of course, leads back to the populism problem, because if parliamentary elections occurring under most electoral rules, they, first of all, mostly did not involve universal suffrage in the 19th century, and even if they do, people are voting for a party. The plebiscite, however, is a more powerful expression of universal suffrage, where people actually get a chance to vote on major policies, or even in the case of presidentialism, to directly elect the president. This principle, if you want, both of them could be called, formally speaking, democratic, namely elections of representatives on the one side, and plebiscites concerning policy and even leadership on the other, are devices which by their nature can make the claim that populists make of embodying, in some sense, the will of the people. This language is used all the time, of course, even in contemporary politics. But it was it was closest to what we now call populism in the case of Bonapartist legitimacy, or Bonapartist plebiscitary politics, because Napoleon, as Marx says, and I didn't have a chance to really look into this historically, Napoleon III makes promises to all classes, and in a way represents at least some of their interests, in a way creating a kind of chain of equivalence between different claims, reconciled through his personality and his decision-making power. I should not spend too much time on this dimension, but I will go through it. Is that how is the proletariat supposed to make a difference in terms of a history in which, if you want, oligarchic form of representation and plebiscitary forms of representation cyclically move one from one to the other? Well, this is perhaps a place where one could ask a question about Marx's own populism. If he discovers the populist problem, does he become a populist himself? In the 1843 text, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right and Introduction, for example, he, after having argued that historically speaking, rising classes can embody, at least temporarily, the interest of the whole. he then turns to the proletariat that is supposed to, in some sense, do the same and yet to do differently. In some sense, it does the same because the proletariat too will have an enemy. It's not enough to have the people, but it's also important to have who the enemy fights against, especially in revolutionary context. But so this, of course, makes the proletariat like previous rising classes, but it is a true universal class from Marx's point of view, because it cannot emancipate itself in a way of establishing its own particular form of property and domination. It doesn't have one. It is, in that sense, truly universal, and it can only free itself by abolishing classes. Bourgeoisie can free itself by replacing one class domination by another, but this the proletariat, in theory, cannot do. But how is this to happen under the in a proletarian revolution or a revolutionary type transformation? I think it's been probably noticed by a lot of people that Marx really has two methods, two models for how this is to be accomplished. I think, though the term dictatorship proletariat is mentioned supposedly only in 3 or 4 of his writings, that is perhaps one important model, but he does have a model based on universal suffrage too. A famous address to the International in Amsterdam, letters to English socialists occasionally expressed the idea that universal suffrage could be a method by which the immense majority, as he believed, could come to power. So dictatorship, proletariat, universal suffrage, or if you want, insurrection and dictatorship, proletariat taken together, and universal suffrage connected to the formation of very powerful working class parties are ultimately the two methods. Marx has a third one, which very briefly, as a result of the Paris Commune, he flirts with the commune model, which is that of direct democratic representation of the people through different sections, but it was only in Paris that this was actually accomplished. Marx doesn't think that the commune could have succeeded. He thinks that the insurrection of 1870, 1871 was at a time when the proletariat was not yet ready to exercise power, but the form, he, at least in some texts, thinks was forward-looking. Is this form connected to dictatorship or to coming to power through the universal suffrage? Engels thought that the commune model was compatible with the reformist parliamentary model of change. There is certainly some doubt about this, and one of the important doubts can be illuminated by Marx's debate with Bakunin. You know that Bakunin is a very famous Russian revolutionary and anarchist, supposedly political anarchist in his conception. We don't have to go into his model, but in one text, which then Marx answers formally, Bakunin raises important questions about the second model of Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat, model. Dictatorship of the proletariat, in other words, the proletariat as ruling class. Bakunin says, who is it going to rule over? Now, remember, he's Russian. Of course, you all understand where he's coming from, and in this sense, his anticipations of the problems of Lenin many decades later comes naturally to him from a sociological point of view. But who is proletariat dictatorship going to rule over? Proletariat as a ruling class, who is it going to rule over? And Bakunin says it got to be the peasantry because this is still the immense majority. He, of course, thinks of Russia, but it turns out that with the exception of perhaps the United Kingdom, the peasant part of the population, the agricultural part of the population, is greater, even in the Germanies, greater than in greater than that of the proletariat. And if you establish a kind of rule over the peasantry, and it will be a dictatorship, won't it try to perpetuate itself? Is the next question Bakunin asks. If you have a dictatorship over the peasantry, with the goal of abolishing classes, but instead, won't there be a tendency for that dictatorship to become perpetual? This is the challenge to Marx. And the reason why I said is that Marx, in a way, does not abandon Model 2, dictatorship of proletariat, the proletariat as ruling class, because in his answers to Bakunin, he doesn't want to retreat from it. And perhaps you get the most realistic depiction of what that is supposed to look like. Yes, the proletariat as a ruling class is still a class. It will have governmental power over the rest of over other classes, and it's not going to be simply temporary, because the abolition of classes is going to take a long time. Now, Marx, aware of where Bakunin is coming from, suggests that there's no reason for the peasantry to be afraid of this, because the policy of the proletariat will be conciliatory and gradualist with respect to peasant property. Bakunin's answer is not known to me, but you can imagine that he was pretty skeptical. I mean, people in power try to accomplish things which are also in their interest, and that this be conciliatory and gradualist will depend only on the actual parallelogram of forces at the time. Now, Marx does suggest that even if it were true that some people would be ruled in a dictatorship and not part of the rulers, he suggests that this is in the answer to Bakunin, that this can be legitimate only if the class in question has a substantial place in the mass of the people. A very unclear expression. In the Communist Manifesto, a decade and a half before, he was speaking of immense majority. Once the proletariat becomes ruling class, it is the dictatorship of the immense majority. Even in England, that would have been difficult to argue, and of course in Germany, much less so, and in Russia, not at all. It's not the immense majority. And so you can see that Bakunin's challenge, it's easy for us to say it now after Lenin and Leninism, that Bakunin's challenge is not really convincingly met by Marx. And indeed, there is another problem, another challenge, which Bakunin does not make, but which Marx himself is forced to face even before that debate, is that bourgeois society and its abolition or its weakening may not lead to just a single alternative stage of history, namely a society in which the proletariat becomes the ruling class. Though in Communist Manifesto and even Das Kapital, it looks like a working class ruled society is going to be the next historical stage. He's forced to introduce another stage, which is our topic for today, namely Bonapartism. Now, of course, from a socioeconomic point of view, and this is related to the issue of cycles that I raised before, from a socioeconomic point of view, there's no need to mention Bonapartism because it still remains within the general interest structure of bourgeois society. So it's not another stage. It's not another stage, right? It is, however, from a political point of view, from a political point of view, a very important phase, if you don't want to call it a stage, or very important development, which the Communist Manifesto and other early Marx texts did not anticipate at all. It becomes so problematic for Marx and Engels too, is that in one place in a letter, Engels says to Marx, "Isn't Bonapartism the true religion of the bourgeoisie?" This would solve the problem of stages, because it would make parliamentary government only an intermediary transitional phenomena. The really important stage is authoritarianism. But Marx himself did not quite go that far. I love his phrase that Bonapartism is to be explained when the proletariat cannot yet and the bourgeoisie can no longer rule. The bourgeoisie can no longer rule, but the proletariat cannot yet. In other words, another form seems to emerge from the point of view of rulership, which is a third, and this is not simply a reduction to the preferred model of the bourgeoisie. It is a model which they would do without if they could. Now, what are its important? What are the reasons for it? Let's say first, and then what are the important steps? I guess I had these in the wrong order. The reasons I described as resolving, as preempting the forms of political challenge that emerge as a result of the parliamentary form of class rule, which means then that the way to preempt the dangers of parliamentary government is to shift in the separation of powers to the executive. Bonapartism is the political form which expresses the dominance of the executive branch over the rest of the political branches. In our discussions here and in New York, of course, we have discussed this particular issue of the separation of powers. In the 20th century, the executive's challenge is very often the courts, and it is the dismantling, packing, and the reduction of the courts that the emergence of the dominant executive almost everywhere produces. In the 19th century, it was still the legislature. Marx pays almost no attention to the judges, and so it is the executive with its instrument, the military, that steps into the space of rule. This becomes then a political form, whether it's the most important form of bourgeois society or only one of the alternative forms. We cannot really answer on the basis of the different texts. But in any case, for this form of rule cannot just simply describe as bourgeois class rule, because it has extremely negative consequences for the bourgeois class itself. And Marx describes how there is support for Napoleon's coup from the various middle class strata, and then the very negative, repressive, and violent consequences, even for members of that class, implied here. On the other side, of course, there is a lot of repression against popular strata. Perhaps from Marx's point of view, the whole preemption argument it becomes most relevant as the form of preempting and interfering and reducing the danger of a proletarian challenge to parties and unions who will be destroyed under this form of executive dominance. So with respect to popular strata, there's a lot of repression, but on the other side, this is the strength of Marx's argument, which is why it became later on so relevant to students of fascism, is that this move has also support. Marx describes it in two forms, one which is more relevant to organizational and the other is more relevant to plebiscitary power. The lumpen proletariat is a place where the leadership of this executive coup is recruited from. What extent it's historically true, I have some doubt about. In any case, some sections of the proletariat itself, sometimes the poorest and in a sense the most alienated in terms of division of labor, can play a role of actually being the shock troops of this type of executive coup. But the most important basis, Marx says, is the peasantry. The peasantry, which really does have a religion of Bonapartism, going back to the period of Napoleon the Great, is the fundamental source. And it has to be because there will be referenda, plebiscites, and it is through the vote of the peasant that Napoleon will dominate through that political form. What's the relation of this form to the proletarian revolution? One, of course, might have suggested in the stage model that the role of Bonapartism is to destroy the previous political form which legitimates bourgeois society. And once it is replaced, it will be replaced by a new form rooted in the rising class, the proletariat. The Paris Commune seems to confirm this type of model, but Marx was ambivalent, as I said, with respect to it. He didn't think the French proletariat was ready. In his mind, the Commune anticipated a political form of the future, but could not establish its dominance. I mean, it lasted too short a time, and Marx was obviously still alive to watch his predictions come true. All the same, the episode of Bonapartism, from this point of view, may have, Marx thought, the longer-term function of weakening the legitimacy of class domination, and perhaps it can play a role as a kind of midwife for future historical changes. Reality never confirms that particular assumption. Now, reality, however, confirms the relevance of the scheme that I have presented. It's really quite amazing. Maybe it's a function of intellectual history and the great power of Marx's ideas and his influence. But I think that in the 20th century, you see reenactments of Bonapartism, which do not require too much freedom with respect to applying the theory. Of course, even with respect to Napoleon III, there is an application of an area model. Calling that Bonapartism in Marx's mind meant that one identifies in some respects the processes of Napoleon the Great, initiated by Napoleon the Great in 1799, and after, with what happens in 1848. So there is a kind of application of the model from previous history, and that's what happens also in the 20th. Marx made a distinction between ascending Bonapartism and descending Bonapartism, something that Trotsky will make a use of also. But in any case, the historical analogy was was used by him pretty strictly. Now, once the 20th century comes around, these analogies become very powerful tools for Marxist thinkers. Obviously, Marx's prestige, the fact that he's not only a theorist of capital, but he's also a theorist of authoritarian societies, comes in handy for those who face authoritarian outcomes in the 20th century. I mean, it's pretty obvious that if you're a Marxist and you look around for something something in Marx that can help explain fascism and Stalinism, this is the only text that you're going to be able to use. But of course, it will involve difficulties. First of all, because Marx kind of uses a kind of stage model as he analyzes the French Revolution, and in part even its reoccurrence and reappearance in the midst of 1848 French Revolution. Now think about the terms Jacobinism, Thermidor, and Bonapartism. If you know the history of the French Revolution, and I think maybe everybody should read at least one good book on the French Revolution, I would recommend François Furet's volumes, which are really the best description. They're kind of long, but just one book would, I think, help us in understanding its immense cultural power through a lot of the 20th century. If you look at the French Revolution, obviously, Jacobinism is the period, represents the period of the emergence of the rule of the Committee of Public Safety, or if you want, Robespierre's very short-lived dictatorship. Thermidor represents the overthrow of Robespierre and his dictatorship, and the attempt to create a viable bourgeois society in French development. And of course, Bonapartism is connected to Napoleon the Great's career. So this trilogy, Jacobinism, Thermidor, Bolshevism, Bonapartism, are the ones that one inherits from Marx. Did he use the same tripartite model when he analyzed authoritarianism in the mid-19th century? I think to some extent he did. He depicts in his writings on the French Revolution at least one party as the heirs of the Jacobins. Blanqui is their most important theorist, so Jacobinism is revived and helps to destabilize and weaken the revolution from at least Marx's perspective. Obviously, Bonapartism is easy to use for that model because there's another Napoleon, but in between them, and this is always a difficulty, there is also a Thermidor. In other words, the shift of the revolution itself toward a more exclusionary, less popular, perhaps a more authoritarian dimension. Leon Trotsky is the first, as far as I know, who begins to use this mode of thought in the 20th century. It's fascinating, and I'm not sure if enough people at this point still know it. Then in 1903, when he's a critic of Lenin and is addressing what is to be done, he accuses Lenin of Jacobinism. This, to Marxists, was a convincing move, because this meant that Lenin was put in the place of Blanqui. And there are a lot of resemblances between Blanqui's elitism and Lenin's model of the vanguard party. And Trotsky points this out. Rosa Luxemburg did too in some texts. I'm not sure if Rosa Luxemburg's first text, I think it was called Leninism or Marxism, I'm not sure of the date now, 1904 or 5, whether she mentions the term Jacobinism. I have to reread it. Doesn't matter. Jacobinism reappears in this scheme. What is, of course, striking about Trotsky is that by 1918, when he is allied with Lenin, and perhaps is the most important figure in the revolution aside from Lenin himself, he affirms that, yes, we are the Jacobins of social democracy. So Jacobinism becomes a positive term. Now, Marxists revive this set of categories to understand their own reality in the first, if you want, first third or first half of the 20th, first third would be, I think, more accurate, of 20th century, encountering two phenomena, right? I mean, you can, I think all of us are pretty conscious that 20th century authoritarianism has its most dramatic and most violent revival in the forms of fascism, and I think arguably Stalinism as well. So these are the two phenomena to deal with, and Marxists who were book-oriented and dominated by Marx's stature as a theorist, of course, want to analyze both of these phenomena from a point of view of his writings. At least some Marxists obviously do. Other Marxists reject that analogical treatment of history. You can always do that because you can say the 20th century, everything is different than it was in the 19th. And of course, that is also a truism. Fascism as Bonapartism, I'm not sure when it starts. I don't think it starts in the period in which Italian fascism is the only important candidate for analysis. I think it was above all the coming to power of the National Socialists in Germany, which motivates this. It is one of the most developed capitalist countries, obviously. It is Marx's home country, and in this sense, taking Germany seriously is something that the tradition readily does. Italy, from that point of view, might look like a minor episode. So fascism is Bonapartism. This is the debate that I want to very briefly, in less than a minute, describe. It's relatively easy, I think, from the point of view of what was happening, to suggest that this is indeed bourgeois society. It is one which has severe governability problems, meaning that important social strata and elites cannot manage to generate policy given parliamentary and party divisions. So the turn to the executive, which is historically, of course, demonstrable, is a solution, and that can be seen in analogy with Bonapartism. Of course, once you had raised the issue of Jacobinism early part of the 20th century and now Bonapartism, the natural question would be Thermidor. History is not being really reduplicated if you leave that out. Yet, in the case of fascism, no one has ever suggested that you could actually locate Thermidor in the development. So you have German democracy as the solution for the divisions during the First World War and before and after, and that democracy becomes ungovernable. Fascism is a kind of reappearance of Bonapartism. The only question is, when does Bonapartism first appear? The only debate was around this question. Some people argued that it was during the presidential governments of Weimar from 1930 to 1933, of which Hitler's was eventually one, but it was already in the Brüning and Schleicher Papen governments, the three previously, that one could speak about the executive playing the dominant role, with Parliament becoming either a rubber stamp or a dissolved entity temporarily. Others, of course, will argue that all these forms of emergency government are not the real Bonapartism, it's fascism, and that is certainly a reasonable position in the debate, given the fact that Schleicher and Papen and Brüning survived for a short period of time, whereas Hitler's government not only is stabilized in 1933, but it is only overthrown from the outside. In that sense, kind of 11, 12-year survival rate even brings it fairly close to the historical claim of Bonapartism. The more interesting problem for Marx is, and this I think is a problem that throws a kind of monkey wrench into the machine of thought, is Stalinism. Now, Trotsky, from 1924 on, is in competition with the dominant sector of the party, and the question that arose for him and others who are excluded is, what is this thing that is happening? We had a revolution, but now this revolution is going wrong. What does it mean? It's moving in a more right-wing direction, was the first thing that they thought during the new economic policy, and going toward an authoritarian context in which the party comes to expropriate all the direct democratic Soviets, organs of workers' control and so on that have existed before. Is this Thermidor or is this Bonapartism, was the question. Initially, Trotsky does not want to accept the idea that it is Thermidor, but many left oppositionists make that argument in relationship to this process already. But in any case, as the context develops from the new economic policy and the importance of the Bolshevik right around Bukharin develops in the direction of Stalin's revolution from above and and his one-person rule, the old historical analogies come back. Interestingly, now Bonapartism becomes the dominant context. Trotsky, who's honest, that's one of the things, he is certainly a great theorist, very dogmatic sometimes, but he tended to be honest, realizes that perhaps he was wrong in rejecting the notion of Thermidor, rigidly Marxist in this respect. If you're going to have Bonapartism, you have to have Thermidor first. Where are you going to locate one and then the other? But Thermidor becomes the turn toward dominance of the party, which is explained as a bureaucratic turn linked to a right-wing policy. And that right-wing policy is overcome with Stalin's revolution from above. So Stalin is Bonaparte, whereas in some unclear way, people like Bukharin become the advocates of a Thermidor. In the end, Trotsky is able to locate both of these phenomena within the revolution. Thermidor is the bureaucratic expropriation process that looks like the French revolutionary expropriation of the revolution by a sector of the bourgeoisie, and then one-person rule and terror from above becomes then the Bonapartist turn. Now, the puzzle, and I end with this, the puzzle now becomes, how is this possible within a Marxian scheme? I mean, they are Marxist theorists, right? And how is it possible to actually place Russian developments into a framework of Thermidor and Bonapartism when the form of property which underlay those historical forms was bourgeois private property? Now it is a nationalized property, which in their minds also meant a worker state. Of course, that equation can be rejected, but in any case, that's how they all thought. Nationalized property means the workers are ultimately the owners. How is it possible under such a form of property to generate a Thermidor and Bonapartism when they were phenomena of the bourgeois of bourgeois development. You could argue for convergence on a very formal level. Marx's phrase, no longer, not yet. In other words, the old ruling strata, whether the bourgeoisie or perhaps even the bureaucracy, are no longer are able to rule, and yet the proletariat is not yet able. This means that Bonapartism becomes again a form of the no longer, not yet, although with respect to a different social basis. This is a very formal solution that really cannot work, and especially cannot work because, amazingly enough, the Stalinist turn of the late 1920s happens in the midst of Italy's fascist turn and Germany's fascist turn. The three phenomena are almost contemporary. So you have Bonapartism in two places, and it is always a function of a not yet, the proletariat that is not able to rule. Is that a sufficient explanation? And Trotsky didn't think so. So he had to answer the question of how come that they appear in the same epoch? Is it imitation? Well, it's possible, of course, to argue, and we do argue that for contemporary context, that authoritarians learn from one another. So clearly Hitler learns from Mussolini, but it may be that that he learns from Stalin also. And those who have analyzed these phenomena under the heading of totalitarianism, a term that Trotsky occasionally used, focus on this type of learning. But his explanation is on a different level, on a causal level. What actually causes these things to happen at the same time, in the same epoch? And the answer, which is not going to satisfy us because we don't have the same faith necessarily in his idea of an international revolution of the working class everywhere or in all important countries, eventually affecting all the rest. But in his case, since he believed in that, he thinks that the failure of that revolution is what produces, the failure of that revolution is what produces the outcome of the no longer, not yet. Because who is going to rule in the place, in the space which is opened by the no longer, not yet may be different, but the structural context within which the not yet occurs is the same. Now, of course, the problem is what's cause and effect. And I think Trotsky himself was pretty conscious of the fact that the Stalinist turn of the working class is one of the reasons why international revolutions, international developments do not favor his own idea of revolutionary change. So in that sense, the ultimate causal factor would be, and I think he would have hesitated in explicitly saying this, is the fate of the Russian Revolution and the transformation of the international working class movement, dominated by its Soviet center in an authoritarian direction. That makes the German phenomena also understandable, because if there would not have been Stalinism or the Stalinization of the German Communist Party, perhaps the communists and the Social Democrats could have been united instead of fighting one another, creating more space for the authoritarian turn. Okay, I stop. I think that's the end of my discussion, and the floor is open for your comments, questions, criticisms, or other issues that you want to bring into this discussion. Let me put in my hearing aid so I hear you better. Okay, who wants to start? Well, let me ask the class. So I can also ask a question. I mean, we were caught in the 1930s in terms of this lecture. That is the argument of Marx uh, cannot be easily transferred to other epochs, which are so different than that historical period. By the way, in that case, one could also even focus on the crisis of the world capitalist system in 1929. I said that I cannot bring together the economic cycle and the political one, but in terms of this 1930s set of problems, Russia, Germany, perhaps Italy to some extent too, certainly that economic factor plays an important role. But the question I want to ask you is the Bonapartism model applicable to other cycles which occur after the Second World War? Is it something that that would still give us at least some uh, uh, handle on explaining developments which are much more general than just a few countries of the 1930s, and which also raised the question of how that can be ended. Remember, Argentina, the question has been explicitly by people like Guillermo O'Donnell, how can you break the cycle? Is proletarian revolution uh, uh, the, uh, the answer to that particular question? But in any case, is this Marx's model of the cycle applicable to any context that you're interested in? That's the question I want to ask the class. So, Mr. Potor, you get to go first.
Thank you. You mentioned Argentina. Are there any differences between the Peronism and the Bonapartism?
Well, I have, oh my God, what's going on here? Stop share, I guess, would be the best way to do it. Okay, it's a good question. My class, my New York class, I do have somebody from Argentina. At the moment, uh, Lucas represents the southern corner of Latin America in this particular group, and he undoubtedly knows more about this than I do. But that's in Argentina, it's impossible to get away from Peronism as the key political tendency that explains the cycle, right? Uh, uh, Now, because there's some Hungarians in the class and there are people from other parts of the world, I think we need to say something about this. Uh, and I can't really now do it off the top of my head because we speak about so many constitutional changes in the France of the 19th century, 18th, 19th centuries. But Argentina is the champion from point of view of alteration between formal democratic government and authoritarian governments brought into power by coups. But you can't explain either dimension of this without the name Peron and Peronism. And I think the way Mr. Potor asked the question, it was not entirely clear whether Peron's figure represents the ascending phase of the cycle or the descending one, right? Because is Peron the figure who actually pushes democratization, or not just Peron, but Carlos Menem and now the Kirchners. So there's several, right, great Peronist leaders. Or is Peronism always the one that initiates the downward turn? This is, of course, a wonderful question in the sense that I use the term populism to describe some of Marx's descriptions of politics in the 19th century. He didn't use the term himself, But for Peronism, everybody uses that, right? For Peronism, populism is not in doubt. And so in that case, is populism a way of initiating change in one direction or the other? Obviously toward some kind of constitutionalism and some kind of authoritarianism. Is Peron, in that sense, a democratic figure, or is he the Bonaparte, if you want, of the Argentinian case? And of course, the answer in this case has to be both. I can't reconstruct this now. I think that Lucas probably knows this much better. But in the other class, I have Argentine student who could do a wonderful presentation of it. Peron takes office within a coup. In other words, an overthrow of an oligarchy, constitutional oligarchy of some time. That's where he takes office, and within that, he initiates a democratic plebiscitary turn. So whatever it is, whether it is he or Evita who have this populist self-understanding to begin with, but the couple at least have it, and they introduce not just elections, but also within the elections a pretty radically plebiscitary appeal to the population based on the demand for social rights. In a way, it's not just populism, but maybe a version of social democracy that appears in Argentina via Peron. So we can put him at the ascending phase, moving from a coup to a plebiscitary democratic order of some kind. But of course, responses to Peron in the end bring down the system, and an authoritarian episode emerges. In subsequent periods, Peronism again plays a plebiscitary role, but there are also moments when it pushes the regime in an authoritarian direction. I would say that happens after 1983 and the Alfonsin government, which becomes less viable because of the Peronist pressure. So I think that in Peron's case, the Bonapartism model will not work most of the time well. He's a general, so in some sense you could think, well, there he is. There is a Bonapartist figure, but the effort was always in a plebiscitary direction, or at least formally democratic direction. That is not a strict analogy with Napoleon, because though Napoleon is plebiscitary, he eliminates the institutions of formal democracy. Lucas can correct me, but I don't think that at any moment Peronist rule in Argentina actually eliminates formal democracy. In other words, whether Peron's himself or his second wife's government or Menem's government or the Kirchner's, they're plebiscitary. That's a good reason for taking seriously the analogy with Napoleonic rule, but at the same time, it's not a replacement of parliamentary rule. It's a kind of superimposition dominated by leadership, and even it depends on who the leader is to how leadership-oriented the Argentine system is at any given time. Yes, then dictatorships emerge several times with a break with this Peronist plebiscitary model, but those dictatorships are created by the military. They tend to be oligarchic. We call them bureaucratic authoritarian regimes, and they represent an alternative to Peronism. Peronism at some moments is violently persecuted by those regimes. So there is a cycle in Argentina. You could say it's between plebiscitary government and oligarchy, it's not exactly the one, it doesn't exactly repeat the cycle that Marx had in mind, or the one that works for fascism. If Perón himself, using his popular support and electoral victories, would have converted the system into an authoritarian one, then the analogy with Mussolini or Hitler would be stronger. But in fact, they don't. Now, of course, there's no determinism here. Mussolini, until early 1920s, mid 1920s, I would say, also retains the formal constitutional features of the Italian system. And it's only after the Matteotti murder that he brings it down. So you could say that Perón is like Mussolini, but he doesn't go all the way. That he stops at a certain point before that would be reached. And of course, then you have the German alliance for Mussolini, so a completely different type of problem. So I would say that that you can use the model for Perón analogically, but you have to kind of see that though there is a cycle, it's not the same cycle, and that Perón does not go as far, and I think Hitler is not the good example here, but Mussolini would be. Hitler, I'm sorry, Perón does not go as far as Mussolini eventually went with respect to the inherited institutions. Okay, I don't know if that's Mr. Potor, I don't know if this is Josef, I don't know if this is answering exactly what you asked, but you can restate it if I need to go back to it.
Thank you.
Okay, so Lucas, please, Lucas von Hornbeck, who is from Brazil. I tell this Hungarian students so they know where you're from. So that's why I said that he knows more about this than I do, since he comes from next door. But it doesn't have to be Argentina.
No, thank you, Andrew. I want to make a more general, broader question, actually.
Of course.
Because it is in the 18 Brumaire that Marx states that, I'm quoting this from the Portuguese version that I have in my head, the translation, but something along the lines of humanity makes history, but not as it wishes. It does so according to the structural and objective circumstances and conditions in which it presents itself. So I wanted to make this broader question to you about how we can interpret the problem, the classical sociological problem of structure versus agency in this particular writing of Marx, considering his relationship to Hegelianism on one side and the teleological standpoint of his whole philosophy of history, and on the other, this very close attention that he pays to the historical circumstances and events which are a part of the interpretation.
Well, this is a great question, and I think we should tackle it at one time or another. It would be easy to give a deterministic version of the Marxian theory, right? A deterministic version that would have historical stages, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. That would be one set. Another set would be domination by bourgeois class, domination by the proletariat, end of classes would be another step. And, there are some ways of reading Marx, and people have read him this way, which shows that it is the tensions and contradictions of each stage that necessarily lead to the next step. That would be one way of understanding this theory. The whole discussion today indicates several problems with this. One is that the political form is not a priori reducible to the social form. In other words, the relationship of what Marxists call base and superstructure is not a neat one. Different superstructures can emerge, which are in some ways still related to the same base. So the idea that the social material basis dominates everything is true only up to a certain kind of point. That is the structure that you're referring to, within which things happen. The second thing we see today is that action matters. I mean, this is a counterfactual question, but what would have happened in France in 1840? Well, let's put it 1850, if I can get the date of the coup d'etat right. But he's elected president in 1848 or 9. What would have happened if he was not around? I mean, he's not just anybody. He's a mediocrity, Marx says, but Marx also stresses the fact that he's Napoleon. He's the nephew of the great man, who is perhaps more a creator of modern France than almost anybody else. Even today, the legal code of France is built on the Code Napoleon in some way. So the great man was Napoleon, and now here's another. That role, you could say, well, I'm Napoleon. Anybody could say they are, but in France, the fact that he was really an heir related was a big factor. So if he wasn't around, what would have happened? Well, it's not clear that some kind of authoritarian regime would have emerged from the revolution of 1848. It could have been an oligarchic parliamentary system that survived. In the end, it is in fact restored in 1871. So in this sense, the leader, the person, matters. And I think the same kind of question: what would have happened in Italy had Mussolini not been the leader of the fascists, or Hitler not the leader of the National Socialists, not Stalin the leader of the Bolsheviks, who Lenin allowed to dominate the organization of the party? What would history have been in any of these cases? And of course, it's very hard to say. But as you say, I think rightly, that for Marx, even these people, whether individuals or groups, cannot make history as they please. So one fact is that history cannot determine the outcome of every historical transformation. But at the same time, leaders also cannot. It is a kind of interaction of the political structure and of actors. Now, in Marx's classical theory, that was why the proletariat is the only solution to the crisis of capitalism. I think most of the time the way he had it was that the crises lead to reconstruction. And only when there's an intervention by a revolutionary class will a crisis lead to a new social formation. So Marx clearly indicates the agency, the active role of the class. But what we're talking about now is the agency and the active role of a person. And, looking around the class, I mean, it's so easy to play this game. What would Iran be like today if Khomeini did not exist and did not have a whole scheme? There's a process going on. In the process, there are many actors. How come that dominates? Could it have dominated without his leadership? And of course, interestingly enough, his group. Napoleon too has his group, the Society of November 18th. Lenin has the Bolsheviks. Hitler has a party. Mussolini too is the leader of a political party. So of course, it's not just a single individual ever that can play the role of an actor that actually changes things, but it's a combination of an individual and a leadership. And in Khomeini's case, we know what it is. And if you're looking around the room, where would Hungary be if Viktor Orban did not exist or remained loyal to his initially libertarian or economic liberal ideas? That cancer cannot be answered a determinist would say somebody else would have played exactly the same role. We could play that game for everybody. If Perón did not exist, some other general would have played exactly the same role. I think that's implausible. It's implausible. Max Weber would stress the charisma of leaders, but it's not enough because some of these people are not that charismatic. I think Victor used to be pretty charismatic. Khomeini has some power, right? I think at least over the milieu of the believers. And Perón, with the help of Evita is much more charismatic than Juan, but nevertheless, the combination of that couple was a charismatic couple. And so, I don't have the student who always asks me about charisma, an American student, Adam Brown. But yes, I think that Weber would say you need a leader with some kind of ability, some kind of power. Mussolini was very powerful that way, certainly, and you can see that different people at different times are. Now that's important. But on the other hand, as Lenin knew, and he was not the greatest speaker of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky was. He knew that an organization is really necessary for leadership to play that kind of role. So leader plus organization produce an actor that can actually make a difference in history, Lucas. That's my answer. Whether they can do anything that they want is another question. I mean, Stalin would have wanted the industrialization process in Russia to overtake all the capitalist countries of the world. They don't, right? So even with that kind of power of centralized leadership, a leader who, to at least some people, had charisma and ideology that is very powerful because it was a kind of transformation of Leninism. Even with all that, they were limited by the historical backwardness of Russia, its heterogeneity, its international constraints. So, of course, if you go from structure to the leader or to the actor, you're going to have to come back from the actor to the structure. And these play a role, but I think to focus on one rather than just the other. Marx certainly was able to focus at different times on both. You can't become the author of class struggles in France, civil wars in France, 18 Brumaire, Louis Bonaparte, without paying attention to actors. A history, right? Imagine writing a history and you're disregarding actors. All you talk about is structure. I mean, some people write history that way today. I think that pretty much any result of that type is unreadable. I mean, you ask yourself, what happened, right, in history? How can you tell what happened without having proper names like Stalin, like Trotsky, like Lenin, like Hitler, like Mussolini, like Perón, like Khomeini? You can't tell these stories without proper names and actors in that sense. But, whether these actors are so powerful, they present themselves as quasi-divine, right? They present themselves as being able to do anything. And that's to some extent how they get the vote from so many different people. When a populist leader like Napoleon III in Marx's description is promising something to the peasant, promising something to the middle class, promising something to the workers, promising something to weird elites and all the rest, and even making promises to neighbors of France, because after all, he needed allies in this political project. He can't deliver on all those things. And the populist rhetoric is the crucial way of uniting these claims, and ultimately under the heading of trust the leader. It cannot be done, but if you trust the leader, maybe it can be done. That's the way people probably think of it. And they all do a lot. This is another thing that I think one has to realize, is that their success is based on also achieving some significant change. And I think today almost everyone would recognize that Napoleon the Great has modernized France, and even Napoleon III continued in the process of industrial development. And obviously, in the case of Hitler, the Great Depression was tamed by the Hitler regime. In that sense, and of course, in the case of Stalin too, you would say, well, this is a peasant country, and in the 1930s they industrialized it. They created an industrial society for the first time with a very large proletariat. So these leaders do achieve some things, but they surely don't achieve either what they promise or what they imagine, because that's where structure comes in. And I think, reading Marx is helpful in this respect, because he's above all a theorist of structure, right? Louis Althusser is not wrong in a structuralist interpretation of Marx. So above all, he's a theorist of structure. But when you read these texts, you realize he's also a theorist of action, of actors, and even leadership. That's the thing that is hardest, because, Marxism is supposed to be a theory of classes. So the class to be an actor is one thing, but to actually realize that a single individual who has an organization can be an actor too. It's not the class that puts Napoleon III to power. The bourgeoisie accepts this and supports it in some way, but it is a much smaller group. Arya, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Andrew. And a question, or a in a way, I had a question about, you asked about the 20th century comparisons and models. I wanted to go back to the 19th century ones, and now the question is in a way related to your comment as well, because in a way, in the 19th century itself, can we did Marx think that the other political actors or other political regimes and states, governments, were an extension of the Bonapartean model? And I'm here referring to both Bismarck, and also I think Marx was also very critical of Bolivar as well, in a way, as a form of this extension of the Bonapartean, the figure of the Bonapartean model. Do you agree with this, or no?
Well, I don't think I would want to go to the 19th century and everywhere find their little Napoleon. So obviously you're not going to be able to do this for Britain. There are people who occasionally apply this model in such a setting too. But Bismarck, that you mentioned, is the one place where Marx himself applies the concept of Bonapartism. I'm not sure of the text. You can maybe find the text, but we can Google Bismarck, Bonaparte, and Marx, and we can probably find quickly enough where he makes that argument. Now, you can see that in the case of Germany, this model is going to be much more problematic to use. I mean, what is Bismarck's great deed, sort of historically? If you actually ask yourself that question, Arya, what would you say what is done? What is the thing that you would most associate with Bismarck? In one sentence or two, Arya. What is
I would say Germany's first rapid industrialism and also nationalism.
Well, that's an ideology, but what is the thing he actually has done?
Labor rights, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, everybody would first put unification of Germany first, right?
Yes.
I mean, you have a territory which is composed of a variety of parts, some of which are dominated by Prussia indirectly, some of which are dominated by Austria. and some are kind of quasi-independent because of very specific locations, for example, commercially. So this is a fragmented setting. 1848, the democratic attempt or the constitutionalist attempt promised to unify it, but fails. So Bismarck unifies it, right? Or at least his policy, which required, it required how many wars? A Danish war, an Austrian war, and the French war. It's war leadership. Now, that you could say is part of the Bonapartist thing, because though you would not say that Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin come to power to their merits in war, each one of them, it wasn't a good word, but they were not meritorious and they were not generals. But you could say Bismarck is at least a statesman, not a general, but a statesman who is in charge of a war effort of a very powerful military state, Prussia. So on one level, there is that kind of Napoleonic aura that you can apply. On the other hand, the problem is completely different, right? To unify a set of separate states, formally separate, some of them really separate, and to conquer territories which are going to be united with it, eventually Alsace and Lorraine, right? This is not the same kind of task that was faced by Napoleon III, although maybe Napoleon I is a forerunner even of this, right? But of course, the internal changes of Napoleon I are on this level much more important, and the shift to dictatorship. Now, Bismarck does not become dictator of unified Germany. He remains chancellor. At best, he's chancellor. There's an emperor. The system is indeed a monarchical system. That's not characteristic of any of our other contexts, right? By the time you have Stalin, you no longer have the Tsar. By the time you have Hitler, you no longer have Kaiser Wilhelm. By the time you have, Mussolini, Mussolini still has the king on his hands, and it's created problems. But in any case, in Bismarck's case, the monarchy is the foundation of an imperial posture. So that makes him different. Somebody mentioned labor law. Somebody mentioned social policy. I don't know, a couple of you already said things which are his big achievements. He does accomplish internal change. I mean, his idea was, Bismarck's idea was to suppress the socialists. That was the most important thing. Suppress the Catholics because they were pro-Austrian or divisive from point of view of the Prussian-centered system. But aside from the suppression, he is also a reformer. Germany gets social policy for the first time. The working class movement is disempowered precisely by taking over some of its goals and ideas. Now, does that fit into the Bonapartist mold? Well, in some respects, yes. And of course, since none of them fit into the same mold, if you look at the actual context, it's not wrong for Bismarck to use it. But still, to say with Engels that Bonapartism is the religion of bourgeoisie might work for France and Germany, but doesn't work for the rest of Europe. There are no little Bonapartes of the Bismarck type even that dominate politics. And of course, not the United States either, which is already part of this capitalist world. So it's in some pockets this model is working. And, our challenge now is to not only adopt the frame, if you want to adopt it, to very different historical circumstances, but to understand how it can be much more general. The de-democratization processes, even in the form of coup and unconstitutional disruption, tended to spread through Latin America in a certain historical phase. Bureaucratic authoritarianism was the last name for that particular model. But what we now call backsliding is much more general than that. And in that sense, can we adopt a frame which was made for unique historical circumstances and could be used for comparative purposes to a framework which is more internationalized if you want, in political science terms, maybe Bonapartism works for single countries very well as a model. It might even work for comparative politics when you compare France in the 19th century to Germany and Russia in the 20th. But does it work for international phenomena? And what we are facing is an international emergence of related autocratic trends. And is this model going to work well for that? That's the question. That is, I think that if you take a single country like Argentina and Peronism, you could see that I could use it a little bit and indicate the difference. But when you're dealing with something that runs across whole continents and to some extent becomes global, does it really work? I'm just thinking of examples. I don't want to get into any unnecessary debates, but would you represent Netanyahu as a Bonapartist? I'm being challenging because that could lead to a political conflict in almost any group today to even mention the name. But on the other hand, look at it. You can look at some of the phenomena, right? Okay, see, I said I'm not going to do it, and I'm doing it anyway. Attack on the courts. Streamlining the relationship of the legislature to the executive. Then war, which is, I didn't think of that until you began to ask me questions. And it doesn't play a big role for Perón. But in many of these cases, war is central to the Bonapartist phenomenon, right? Even Khomeini manages to consolidate his rule fully after the war with Iraq. So we see war as, and that's natural, right? Because Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the greatest generals in human history, right? So that war is an interesting aspect of this. And Bismarck, 3 wars, right? 3 wars in the case of Bismarck. That was not a minor fact because Germany could not be unified according to linguistic affinities unless you beat the Danes. That's how you get Schleswig-Holstein. Unless you beat the Austrians, that's how you get control over Bavaria. And you beat the French and you get Alsace-Lorraine. So Germany is a product of war. And the Bismarckian, I'm sorry, the Napoleonic leader, not a man with too much charisma, by the way. Bismarck was never accused of being a charismatic leader, but nevertheless follows in the path of Napoleon the Great. Not Napoleon the Little, because Napoleon III, though he had one adventure in Italy that was not very successful, and then loses a war to Germany. So this was a paradox. It also shows that the model could work on the basis of internal politics primarily. Because in Napoleon III's case, it was not wars that brought him to power. I think he had some kind of war experience, but not significant. So war is often the Bonapartist mechanism, but it is not necessary for the phenomenon. I think you could see that for exactly the example that, well, of course, the Uncle's Wars, right? The Napoleonic myth of Napoleon III was based on the Uncle's wars and successful conquest. So war symbolically plays a role for Napoleon III, right? I think that's an important phenomenon. Now, does it play a role for Perón? I would say no, right? I mean, eventually war comes home to Argentina and brings down the oligarchy during the Falklands-Malvinas crisis. So war is never entirely absent from our history of authoritarianisms. It can bring down an authoritarian regime or help to consolidate the authoritarian regime. War is an important part of the phenomenon. Generals who lose a war, like losing the Falklands, are finished. And Napoleon III, who really lost a big one to Bismarck in Germany, was finished. There was no question of his continuation in power after that. Bismarck could have played along with that if he made him into a puppet, but that was impossible. He was overthrown from the ground up. So war is a pretty significant part of this. I don't know if Uncle Charlie, that's my nickname for Marx, I don't know if Uncle Charlie really integrated war into his analysis of the Bonapartist phenomenon. I think he does in terms of the myth of the uncle, but still he does not stress it enough. Maybe because he's a theorist of class struggle. And class struggle is one of the forms of modern political conflict, but war is just as important or even more important, as we see these days. I mean, this is going to be something that we will have to be living with for some time, that a very destructive war has been reintroduced into the political realm. Putin certainly benefits from war. That's why he started it. But he's also benefiting from this war in the Near East. So in that sense, authoritarianism and war, and of course the Hitler regime is inseparable from its tendency to war from the outset. Mussolini less so, but he thought he was clever. He would find small wars. In Libya, in Ethiopia, you fight wars that you can win. But via Hitler, he got into the big war. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah, anybody, please.
No, there is a very good book about revolution and war in Marx. I will send it.
Hannah Arendt, yeah,
Yes,
begins
okay.
with revolution and war.
Yeah.
On revolution begins with that chapter. So she's really aware of it. Yes. Yeah, but that's a different theory, and for her, I don't. Do I have the book handy? Looking in the.
No, I meant Marx. Marx himself.
Marx, where is war?
Well, no. There is a very good book on Marx's ideas about revolution and war. I will send it.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm looking now for Hannah Arendt for a second, although you may mishear that.
But in a way, what you're saying also, of course, the war and also the question of nationalism also comes into.
So the question of what?
Nationalism also, I think it is a thing that connects all these, right? Bismarck.
I was going to, for the next semester, I was going to do this, the course trying to explain authoritarianism in terms of three big blocks. One would be economics. So capitalism is the slogan of that. We didn't talk about capitalism much just now, but I think obviously the whole Marxian thing is linked to structural assumptions about capitalism and its logic, right? I'm going to then, after capitalism, take nationalism. And then I will deal with a separate block in terms of international affairs, international law. But obviously nationalism, I mean, ask yourself if any of the figures I mentioned today is not a nationalist. It's almost it's almost a given, right? Now, this is actually linked to war in some way, because it is in war that nationalists generally test their claims and their bona fides and their ability to rule, right? You can be a nationalist ideologically, but what makes you, against other nationalists, capable of ruling? Well, war leadership, or your uncle's war leadership in the case of Napoleon III. In any case, war and nationalism are linked, but to some extent separate phenomena, because you will not find in every single setting nationalism as the reason for war. In the let us say in the German case, nationalism plays a role, but in any case, the outcome of the previous war and its territorial settlement are perhaps more important, and they're important for not just nationalists but for others as well. So nationalism, yeah, it's linked to this this phenomenon, to Bonapartism. Napoleon certainly is following in the nationalist rhetoric of the French Revolution, and in a way fulfills the wildest dreams of the revolutionaries in terms of spreading the revolution across Europe. So in this sense, revolutionary nationalism, yeah, is an important part of this picture. Again, I focused on Marx, and I did not see war play a major role in his analysis of Bonapartism, although I think indirectly it's present through the myth of Napoleon the Great. And nationalism, I didn't see at all. Now, that doesn't mean it's right, of course. But what you're saying could be a very important component, and I can't think of too many of these Bonapartist efforts without some kind of nationalist support. I mean, nationalism and populism are themselves related, right? I mean, the French Revolution has both the slogan of Le Peuple and La Nation, and these terms are even kind of identified. So revolutionary nationalism has many of the same assumptions as does populism, namely that the interests of the nation are one, that it is possible to act on behalf of those by a unified actor of some kind, either a popular mobilization, as in the classical revolution, or a leader like Napoleon. So Napoleon becomes a representative and embodiment of the French nation from this point of view. And to the extent that such ideologies are already available, it's more easy, I think, to make those claims and to play that role. Well, thank you very much. We'll move for this class next Monday to international law, and what international law will tell us about authoritarianism and backsliding and democratic rights and so on. That's our topic for next week, for both sessions in a way. And I don't see anybody there now. Oh yeah, Lucas is still there from the New York class. That will be one of our topics also in New York. We're gonna eventually have a presentation on one revolution. We're moving Aria's presentation to another week, and then we move on to different historical periods, at least in the New York class. So thank you very much. Appreciate those who stayed with us today. But there will be a tape, right? So there will be a recording for those who would like to hear it and who are not able to come. So thanks a lot. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
All of you at different times, and thank you for.
Thank you very much.
What? Okay.
Köszönjük szépen, viszontlátásra.
Yeah, viszontlátásra minden jót. That's
Viszontlátásra, sziasztok!
that's Hungarian. Our language is really the language that Adam and Eve spoke. So that is the original human language. And then Tower of Babel, and this language was made into just one among many. It's some people would say Hebrew was that language, but of course,
no.
That is pretty implausible. Hungarian is a better candidate. Okay, thank you. All the best.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
See you Monday.